Hello everyone and welcome to this next video tutorial. So I'm coming back to painting this Space Wolf guy, Primaris Battle Leader, that I've done a little bit of a conversion on. So I just want to get this guy done, and I think he's going to be a bit of fun to work on, and I'll hopefully have a few videos coming out of this model. So this video today, we'll be going through painting this head. Another tutorial on doing skin. It'll be a little bit different to the Genestealer Cults one, if you've watched that already. There are some warmer tones coming into play. So without further ado, I'm going to present my palette. So I've laid it out in a similar fashion to the previous video. If you haven't watched that one already, I would recommend watching that. So I thought I'd also just lay out show off my method for mixing paints. So we talk about, mixing paints in parts. And so this is probably the way most people would do it, I would assume. But I kind of just sort of, dot out equal sized little dots of paint just to get it a bit more accurate. So I'm going to go through all the paints again. So starting up here, we've got Cadian Fleshtone, which will be the base colour. We've got Bugman's Glow, which will be the initial sort of soft shading. 2:1 parts Bugman's Glow and Doombull Brown, which will be the secondary shading. And then for the final shading, just to sort of sharpen up the recesses and stuff, we've got 2:1 Bugman's Glow, Doombull Brown, and Rhinox Hide. So, but same as that, just adding a bit of Rhinox Hide into it to darken it up. Then for the first highlights, we've got Kislev Flesh, so just pure Kislev Flesh. A 2:1 Kislev Flesh and Pallid Wych Flesh. So that's the secondary highlight. And we may use just straight Pallid Wych Flesh for some highlights. Some really sharp highlights, but I'll see how I go with that. And then Tuskgor Fur here. What I'm going to use this for is just in some areas, just using it to add a bit of warmth. You'll notice if you look at reference photos of painting faces and stuff, that some areas on the face will be quite red, and these are the areas that where blood is quite close to the surface of the skin. So this surface will appear to have a slight pink tint to it. So that's what we're going to use that for. Unfortunately, like areas that you would naturally see a lot of that would be sort of the midsection of the face. So we're talking about like cheeks, the nose, and unfortunately this guy is not showing off his cheeks or his nose because he's got this half helmet faceplate thing on. But there will be some areas where I'll probably glaze it in a little bit, just to get things looking a bit more natural. So that probably won't go without use. And then the final one is Dark Reaper. So this is an interesting one. It's a slight blue tone, slight blue hue to it. So that will be used to really sharpen some of the shading. So I'm thinking about areas under the eyelids. Again, if you look at reference material on painting faces and things like that, you'll notice a lot of the lower third of the face, and then also some areas in deep shadow will appear to have a blue tint to them. So that's what that's going to be useful for. It's not going to play a huge role, but it will just help to sharpen things a bit. All right, so starting with the base coat, as I said, Cadian Fleshtone. I'm just adding some water to that. You'll notice I haven't pre-shaded this one, or sort of zenithal highlighted it. That's just because I painted black straight over, because I'd airbrushed the whole model. I've just painted black straight over the skin just to give me a nice, clean base to work over. So, just going to move that out of the way. So starting with the Cadian Fleshtone, pretty simple, getting a nice base coat on it. It also helps sometimes when you're working over black areas like this, just to leave a nice fine black line right where the that edge is, that shadow would be. It just really sharpens and really creates that separation between those two surfaces. Yep, so, I mean, you know, as per usual, going with multiple thin coats on that rather than trying to get it all in one go, just to get a nice smooth finish. Okay, so that was 3 coats in total to get a nice finish. So now I'm going to move on to doing the first shading. So taking that Bugman's Glow and thinning it down to basically like a glazing consistency. So something similar to, like I've mentioned in the past, something similar to one of the shade wash paints from Games Workshop. Maybe a little bit thicker. And then just using that to slowly, glaze into the first shadow areas. So, obviously, we've got painted parts here already on the model, so I'm trying to be a bit cautious with it. So, one area that's nice to define is in this temple area, and to get that kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, but the side of the brow there defined, it really kind of sharpens that edge on the face, and particularly for a masculine character, it really chisels out those shapes of the face. So yeah, like I said, we've got a painted area already. Obviously the hair's not painted, so I can be a bit haphazard with painting everything in these areas, but being careful of the areas you've already painted. I mean, it'd be easy enough to clean it up if we make mistakes, but it's always better to try and be cautious. So, picking out some of these details here with these first soft shading. And obviously the pink hue of the Bugman's glow is just getting things looking a bit more natural. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good for the first stage of shading. Pretty quick and simple. So now I'll move on to the next stage. Okay, so the next stage is introducing the small amount of Doombull Brown, as mentioned before. So getting things a little bit darker. And same sort of consistency for that one, actually. And basically just probably need to be a bit thinner. Basically, we're just building on top of what we've already done. Just starting to sharpen that a bit more. So you can see, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, if you haven't watched the other video, it wouldn't make much sense, but the Genestealer Colts skin that I did, I was really going for a nice pale look for the Genestealers, so I did that intentionally. Whereas this guy, being a Space Marine, going for warmer tones, something more, a bit more human. So I think that's it for the second stage of highlighting. So as you can see, it's really starting to sharpen things up. I've worked it into this area, as I mentioned with the last stage, really starting to sharpen that edge there and defining the face. So now we'll move on to the final stage of the shading. All right, so we've got this mix here for the final stage. Same as the previous, but just adding a bit of Rhinox Hide to darken things up. And with this one, I think I'm going to change to go down to a finer brush, because with this stage I'm going over what I've done already, as with the previous stage, but just really starting to sharpen things up. So getting it right into where the skin meets other areas of the model, other surfaces. And just really helping to sharpen things up and set things apart a bit. So under the hairline a bit. Under here to bring out those little bionic elements. Oops, gone with the wrong colour. And then really sharpen up this brow. This will also be handy for kind of a foundation for right under his eyebrow there. Lost focus there. Okay, so yeah, that's basically the extent of what I'm going to do with that final shading. So I'm just, sharpen things up a bit. Introducing the highlights will really start to, build the contrast and really get things a lot more defined. So I'm going to move on to that now. So I'm going back to the original brush that I had, thinning out this Kislev Flesh a little bit. And I'm using the same approach as the other video for painting skin. Obviously, if you haven't seen it, you might not know what I'm talking about. But I'm going to sketch in these highlights a bit. It's not a huge area, so I'm just going to really define that, where this highlight's sitting on the edge of his head there. And a lot of the other areas are just really small anyway. So it's going to be just a lot of glazing, I would say. So maybe just really define the highlight there. Define this edge there. So, I mean, in terms of application for this process, I mean, you could use it for painting tabletop quality stuff if you're wanting to get a nice, something that looks a little bit nicer than just sort of, the bare minimum of, doing a base wash and a few highlights or whatever, and getting things a bit smoother using this process. In terms of the highlights, I mean, you could just leave it like that if you wanted to. But I just like doing a little bit of glazing to really sort of smooth things out. So I've just thinned that paint out a little bit more, this Kislev Flesh, and then getting rid of some of the excess, and then slowly just pushing it towards the highlight really gently with the brush. And I'm going to bring it towards there. Be able to blend coming away from that hairline. And then glazing a bit down into the brow. And I mean, with glazing, like you may have noticed with we're doing the highlights here. I'm bringing it from down here, and there's nothing really wrong with sort of going over what you've already done. As long as you're doing it with a nice thin paint. Because really what it does is it starts to sort of harmonize everything. So going over with a lighter paint like this just sort of smooth things off a lot, and it just sort of brings everything together. All right, I think that's looking pretty good for the first stage of highlights. So see it's starting to just look a bit more well-rounded and a bit more defined with that highlight. So we'll move on to the secondary highlights. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, the secondary highlight consists of 2 parts of the Kislev Flesh, and then introduces 1 part of the Pallid Wych flesh. So, starting to lighten things up a lot. So, I'm going to use this in a similar fashion to the previous paint. So, going over what I've done in a layering sort of fashion. So, just approaching it with glazes though. I mentioned in previous videos using the lamp as a reference for where the light's hitting, so there's a nice amount of light coming off the top of his head here. Hitting his forehead here. Just slowly and softly building that up. Pretty happy with how that's looking so far. Again, you can bring the glazing up from a bit further down. Just to really soften everything off. Yeah, pretty happy with that. So I think I will actually introduce a bit more Pallid Wych flesh. So I'm going to I'll just get that on the palette now, and then I'll come back and do a bit of that. All right, so I'm just going to actually so I've got the Pallid Wych flesh there, and I'm just gonna mix a bit of the previous highlight into there. And then just use this to really define some of the kind of the detailed, really raised areas. I'm actually going to thin that down to a glazing consistency and also create a little spot highlight here. Just for a bit of visual interest, and I'll add it over here as well. Cool. Pretty happy with that. So we'll move on to the next stage. Introducing some of that Tuskgor Fur into some areas, just to make things look a bit more natural. So I'll move on to that now. Okay, so with the Tuskgor Fur, getting quite thin with that, and then just around these little can't remember what they call the things in his head, bringing up that pink hue there just to suggest that they are kind of a scar, really, this sort of scar tissue area. The brow a little bit. This is very, very minor. It's not, I kind of wanted to show it more in the cheeks and things like that, but I kind of forgot that this guy wasn't actually showing his cheeks at all. So just adding a very subtle little pink hue. Yeah, that's basically it for that, really. So, the last stage, introducing the Dark Reaper a bit. So, same with that, getting it very thin because it's a big change in the hue. We're going with, it's a blue colour going over a flesh colour. So, getting it nice and thin, and then really just using the edge of the brush, the tip of the brush, just to sharpen the brow under there. I can even use a little bit to sharpen some of these areas that are in deep shade and those kind of separation areas. Alright, so pretty simple that really. Just adding a little bit of sharpness to some of the areas, really defining the shading. Yeah. Alright, so I'm actually going to paint his eyes as well. So when I paint eyes, I mean, a lot of, people would think, eyes are white, so use a white paint. But sometimes using white can make things look a bit unnatural, actually. The eyes start to look a bit too bright. So what I like to use is a very light fleshy colour. So I'm going to go with, this bit here where I've mixed in a bit of Pallid Wych Flesh into the secondary highlight mix. So obviously key is using a nice fine brush. This is a size 0, broken toed. Getting a nice fine point. And what I like to do is hold the brush and have the bristles parallel to where the eye is. And then, if I can actually see it properly, just going in really lightly. I don't even know if this is going to show up much on film. So I have made a mistake there, you can see. There's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes it's kind of necessary to get a nice clean look. Because, you can easily go back, grab some of that base colour or whatever colour would sort of work for the area and just go over. Even darken things up a little bit. Just redefine that bottom eyelid. Alright, and then for the eyes, I'm just going to use some of that Dark Reaper there. It's already on the palette. So really, I mean, with this, you want a really nice fine point as well. And then just holding it dead on to his eye. Aiming for the middle of the whites of the eye. And again, you might not get it where you really want it, but you can always neaten things up a bit by introducing more of the colour that you've used for the whites of the eye. I mean, just, yeah, neatening things up with a nice fine brush. So looking all right. The iris on his left eye's gone a bit too high, so I'm just going to reintroduce some of the shading colour just to neaten that up a bit. His right eye is actually not looking too bad. And then overshot onto his bottom eyelid as well, so just going to neaten that up a bit too. It's really, I mean, it's just one of those things that really just requires practice and good brush control. Definitely a lot of patience. And honestly, a lot of just making mistakes and trying again and trying to neaten things up. So, what I also like to do is, and this is probably one of the more tedious things, is create a defining shadow underneath between the white of the eye and the bottom eyelid. And it helps to use a darker colour with that, so I'm going to go with the that final shading colour. So, getting a really nice fine point. Actually, I'm not happy with how dark that is, so I'm just going to mix a bit of Dark Reaper into that. Again, when you do this, you might be having to go back in and reintroduce some of the colour for the whites of the eye. So, what can actually help to bring out that definition is bringing up the highlight on the bottom eyelid. Alright, I think that's looking okay. You can see I've messed up a lot on the armor parts that I've already painted, but that's not to worry. It's pretty easy to clean up anyway. Yeah. So I've got to say there's some of the harder eyes I've had to paint, just because it's hard to get right in under the brow and between the brow and the mask there. So yeah, I think that's it for this little tutorial. I hope it's been helpful to someone out there at least. Yeah, so thank you once again for your support. It really means a lot to me that I have people supporting me and allowing me to make these little videos for you, and I really hope that they've been helpful and informative. So yeah, thank you so much.